"Dad, you're not sitting here tonight." My daughter-in-law said it with such calmness that, for a moment, I wondered if I had heard her correctly. 32 people were gathered around my Thanksgiving table. My table. The same table my wife and I had chosen nearly 3 decades earlier. The same table where my son had blown out birthday candles as a boy. The same table where I had watched my wife carve the turkey every Thanksgiving until the year she was gone. And now my daughter-in-law, Vanessa, was standing behind my chair, one hand resting on it like she owned it. She looked directly at me. "You should find another seat." Nobody laughed. Nobody defended me. My son, Ethan, simply lowered his eyes. That hurt more than her words. I slowly folded my napkin. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why. I didn't even look angry. I stood up and walked toward the hallway. But what they didn't know was that I had already discovered what they were planning to do to me. And 20 minutes later, I was going to make the first move. My name is Arthur Bennett. I'm 68 years old. And before I tell you how my own family tried to erase me from the life I had spent decades building, tell me where you're watching from tonight. Because if you've ever been made to feel like a burden by the people you sacrificed everything for, you may understand what happened next. For 40 years, I owned Bennett Home Supply. I started with one tiny store and a borrowed delivery truck. By the time I retired, I had 9 locations spread across 2 counties. I wasn't born wealthy. Everything I had came from early mornings, unpaid weekends, bad investments I learned from, and years when my wife, Evelyn, and I had to count every dollar before buying groceries. When Evelyn died, the house changed. Not physically, emotionally. The rooms became quieter. Her favorite chair stayed beside the window. Her recipe cards remained in the kitchen drawer. Even the garden outside seemed to wait for her to come back. I thought having my son and his wife move in would help. Ethan's technology business had collapsed after a string of failed contracts. He told me he needed somewhere to rebuild. I didn't hesitate. "Stay as long as you need," I told him. That sentence became my first mistake. At first, everything seemed normal. Then little things began changing. Vanessa suggested I move into the downstairs bedroom because the stairs were too much for me. I agreed. Then Ethan needed my study for his business. I packed away decades of photographs, financial records, and letters from Evelyn. Nobody helped me. I carried the boxes downstairs myself. I told myself it was temporary. Then I noticed the new car. A black luxury SUV appeared in my driveway. Then came expensive deliveries, designer furniture, restaurant receipts. And one afternoon, I noticed a contractor leaving my basement. I asked Ethan what he was doing. He smiled. "Just making a few improvements, Dad." I nodded. But something about his answer bothered me. Because I had never approved any renovations. And I knew exactly how much contractors charged. A few days later, something even stranger happened. The mail arrived at 10 in the morning. Normally, I collected it myself. But Ethan was already standing outside. He took the envelopes from the mail carrier before I reached the porch. Then he disappeared into his office. 45 minutes later, he returned with a thin stack of mail. My property tax notice. A grocery advertisement. Nothing else. I stared at him. He smiled. "That's everything." Maybe another man would have believed him. I didn't. I'd spent 40 years learning that the biggest financial disasters rarely begin with a missing $1 million. They begin with one missing envelope. The next morning, Ethan collected the mail again. Then the next. And the next. 4 days passed. On the 5th morning, I watched him walk into his office carrying the entire stack. The door closed, and something inside me finally broke through the denial. That afternoon, after Ethan and Vanessa left the house, I walked into the garage. There was a second trash bin hidden behind some storage boxes. Inside it were hundreds of shredded documents. I stood there staring at the pieces. Then I saw something white sticking out from underneath the pile. I pulled it free. My hands went cold. Because across the top of that torn page was the logo of my bank. And underneath it was a number so large that I had to read it twice. $675,000. But the worst part wasn't the amount. It was the name printed beneath it. Mine. I hadn't borrowed that money. I hadn't signed anything. And yet someone had apparently borrowed nearly $700,000 using my identity. I looked toward the house. For the first time, I wasn't wondering whether my son was hiding something from me. I was wondering how long he had been planning it. And then I noticed one more line on the document. A line that made my stomach drop. Loan secured against the Bennett property. My home. The house Evelyn and I had spent our entire marriage protecting. I folded the torn paper and slipped it into my pocket. I didn't call Ethan. I didn't call Vanessa. I didn't confront anyone. Because suddenly I understood something. If they believed I knew nothing, then I had an advantage they couldn't see. And the next thing I discovered inside my bedroom safe would tell me just how far my own son was willing to go. The next morning, I waited until I heard Ethan's car disappear down the driveway. Then I went upstairs. I hadn't opened the small fireproof safe in months. There were things inside that I couldn't bring myself to look at anymore. Evelyn's wedding ring, her anniversary necklace, my passport, our old property documents, things that belonged to a life I had spent 42 years building with one woman. I entered the combination. The lock clicked. I opened the door. For several seconds, I simply stared. My passport was there. The property deed was there. The insurance papers were there. But the small velvet box was missing. I searched the safe twice. Then a third time. Nothing. Evelyn's wedding ring was gone. The necklace she wore on our 25th anniversary was gone too. I sat on the edge of the bed. That was the moment the financial problem became something much more painful. Someone hadn't simply targeted my house. Someone had entered the most private part of my life. And they had taken pieces of the woman I loved. I wanted to believe there was another explanation. Maybe Ethan had borrowed them. Maybe Vanessa had moved them. Maybe I had somehow misplaced them. But deep down I already knew. The missing jewelry was worth money. But to me it was priceless. I could replace a house. I could replace a car. I could even rebuild a business. I couldn't replace Evelyn. I picked up her photograph from the nightstand. "I'm sorry," I whispered. Then I put it down. I wasn't going to confront Ethan. Not yet. Because anger makes people careless. And I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. That morning, I drove to First Valley Bank. I had been banking there for more than 30 years. My account manager, Nadia Patel, knew me well enough to recognize something was wrong before I said a word. She closed the office door. "Arthur, what's happened?" I slid the torn loan document across her desk. She read it, then read it again. Her expression changed. "Did you authorize this?" "No." "Did you sign a power of attorney?" "No." She turned toward her computer. A few minutes later, she rotated the monitor toward me. There it was. A digital application for a home equity loan. My name, my address, my social security number, and beneath it, a scanned power of attorney document giving someone authority to manage my financial affairs. I stared at the signature. It looked almost perfect. Almost. But I knew my own signature. There was one small difference. The final stroke was wrong. Someone had copied it. Nadia zoomed in. Then she noticed something else. "The notary stamp," she said. "What about it?" She checked the records. Her face went pale. "This notary's commission expired last year." My stomach tightened. "So the document is fake?" "Yes." She immediately froze the loan application. But then she looked at me with an expression I will never forget. "Arthur, there's something else." She pulled up another screen. There had been several recent inquiries into my financial accounts. Not one. 7. Someone had been studying my money, my investments, my property, my retirement accounts, my entire financial life. I leaned back. For 40 years, I had taught managers to watch for patterns. One strange transaction meant very little. 5 meant trouble. 7 meant someone was preparing to make a move. "Can you tell who accessed them?" I asked. Nadia hesitated. "Some activity came through credentials connected to your household." I didn't need her to say the name. I already knew. When I returned home that afternoon, I changed nothing. I smiled at Ethan. I asked Vanessa how her day went. I even listened while Ethan talked about a business opportunity he claimed would turn everything around. But something had changed. They thought I was blind. I decided to let them keep thinking that. That evening, I bought a small security system. No dramatic gadgets. No alarms. Just discreet cameras covering the places where important conversations happened. The office, the kitchen, the hallway, and the sunroom. I installed them after everyone went to bed. For the first 2 nights, I heard nothing useful. Normal conversations. Complaints about bills. Ethan talking about clients. Vanessa discussing Thanksgiving. Then, on the 3rd night, at 11:47 p.m., the camera caught them sitting in the kitchen. Ethan placed a folder on the table. Vanessa opened it. I turned up the volume. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Are you sure this will work?" Ethan answered. "It has to. What if he notices?" "He won't." Then Vanessa asked the question that made my blood run cold. And if he refuses to sign? Ethan didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the hallway. Then he said something that I had to replay 3 times to understand. We don't need him to sign anymore. I froze, because that meant the forged loan wasn't their final plan. It was only the beginning. Vanessa closed the folder. Then what happens after Thanksgiving? Ethan leaned closer to her. And when I heard the next sentence, I realized they weren't planning to take my house. They were planning to take me out of it. For the first few seconds, I couldn't breathe. Ethan's words kept replaying inside my head. We don't need him to sign anymore. I sat alone in my bedroom, staring at the tiny screen in my hand. Then Vanessa asked the question I had been afraid to hear. What happens if the doctor doesn't agree? Ethan answered quietly. He will. I pressed my fingers against my forehead. A doctor. They were planning to involve a doctor. But why? I listened again. This time, I caught something I had missed. Vanessa whispered, once he's declared incapable, everything becomes easier. My entire body went cold. They weren't trying to convince me to sell my house. They weren't trying to get me to sign a loan. They were planning to make the world believe I was no longer capable of making my own decisions. And once that happened, the forged power of attorney could suddenly become very useful. I stopped the recording. For several minutes, I just sat there. I looked around the room. The old lamp Evelyn had chosen. The framed photograph from our 35th anniversary. Her favorite blanket folded across the chair. This wasn't just my house. It was the last piece of our life that remained untouched. And my own son was preparing to take it from me. I wanted to cry. Not because I was afraid of losing money. Because I was finally understanding that Ethan had already lost something far more important. He had lost whatever part of him still remembered being my son. The boy who used to sleep beside me during thunderstorms. The teenager who once told me he wanted to build a company bigger than mine. The young man I had trusted enough to give a second chance after his business failed. That was the part that hurt. I had opened my door because I loved him. He had walked through it because he saw an opportunity. The next morning, I called Nadia. I told her everything. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she said, "Arthur, you need someone who understands the legal side of this." I already knew who to call. His name was Samuel Cross. Samuel had been a county prosecutor for more than 30 years before retiring. We had met through a local business association decades earlier. He wasn't the kind of man who made dramatic promises. He simply listened. When I showed him the documents, his expression hardened. "This isn't a family argument," he said. "No, this is a coordinated financial crime." I nodded. "And they're attempting to establish a competency narrative." That phrase stayed with me. A competency narrative. They didn't need to prove I was actually incapable. They only needed enough people to believe I was becoming confused. Then every strange mistake could become evidence. A forgotten appointment. A repeated question. A misplaced receipt. Anything. Samuel looked at me. "Don't confront them." I wasn't planning to. Good. Because the moment they realize, they'll change everything. He helped me document every suspicious transaction. The fraudulent loan. The forged power of attorney. The missing jewelry. The account inquiries. The contractor. The mail. Everything. Then he asked me one question. "Do you know why they're waiting until Thanksgiving?" I shook my head. "Because they want witnesses," he said. That sentence bothered me. Witnesses to what? Samuel leaned back. "Whatever they plan to make you do." I didn't sleep much that night. For the next several days I watched. I listened. And I waited. Ethan became unusually attentive. He started asking whether I was sleeping well. Whether I remembered taking my medication. Whether I had trouble concentrating. Questions that sounded caring to anyone else. But I knew better. He was building his story. Then one afternoon, Vanessa brought me a cup of tea. She sat across from me. "Arthur, we worry about you." I smiled. "That's kind of you." She hesitated. "You've seemed forgetful lately." There it was. The first brick in the wall. I looked directly into her eyes. "What have I forgotten?" She smiled nervously. "Nothing serious." I took a sip of tea. "Then there's nothing to worry about." Her smile disappeared. That evening I checked the cameras. At 9:18 p.m., Ethan and Vanessa entered the office. A third person was with them. A man I had never seen before. He placed a folder on Ethan's desk. Then he said something that made every muscle in my body tighten. "The Thanksgiving dinner gives you the perfect opportunity." Ethan asked, "And after that?" The stranger opened the folder. "After that, Arthur won't be making decisions about the property anymore." I leaned closer to the screen. Then the man said the one thing I hadn't expected. The facility has already been contacted. I felt my heart sink. They had already chosen where they intended to send me. And suddenly, Thanksgiving wasn't just a family dinner. It was the day they planned to take control of my life. But they had made one mistake. They had given me 6 days to prepare. And I intended to use every single one. 6 days. That was all the time I had before Thanksgiving. 6 days before my son intended to convince everyone I was losing my mind. 6 days before strangers could potentially walk into my home and tell me where I was going to live. But Ethan had misunderstood one thing. I wasn't going to fight him emotionally. I was going to let him believe his plan was working. The next morning, I became more careful than I had ever been in my life. I didn't argue. I didn't question the strange man from the office. I didn't mention the cameras. And most importantly, I didn't let Ethan know that I had already spoken to Samuel. Instead, I gave him exactly what he wanted to see. An aging father who seemed tired. A little forgetful. A little distracted. A little vulnerable. It was difficult. Every instinct inside me wanted to expose them. But Samuel kept reminding me of one thing. Let them keep talking. So I did. That afternoon, Ethan came into the kitchen while I was making coffee. "Dad, did you take your morning pills?" I looked at him, then deliberately paused. "I'm not sure." His eyes changed immediately. Concern. Or what looked like concern. "I'll get them for you." He walked toward the cabinet. I watched him carefully. He opened the wrong drawer first. Then the second. Finally, he found the bottle. "Here." I smiled. "Thank you, son." He stood there for a moment, then asked, "Do you remember what day it is?" I almost laughed. Instead, I looked at the calendar. "Tuesday." He nodded. "Right." Then he walked away. I waited until he disappeared. That single question told me more than he realized. He wasn't checking on me. He was rehearsing. That evening, Samuel arrived quietly. We sat in my garage with the door closed. He brought a folder. Inside were copies of every document we had collected. The fraudulent loan application, the forged authorization, the account activity, and evidence that someone had contacted a private medical facility about me. Samuel had also contacted the bank's fraud department. The loan was now frozen. But there was another problem. "If they try to move money before the investigation is complete," he said, "we need to know immediately." "I'll watch them." "No," Samuel said firmly. "You'll live normally. Let me handle the legal side." I looked at him. "What if they succeed?" "They won't." He said it calmly. But then he lowered his voice. "Arthur, there's something you need to understand." "What?" "The person who contacted the facility didn't just ask about your admission." He opened another page. "They sent them a medical summary." I stared at the document. The summary described an elderly man experiencing confusion, memory loss, financial irresponsibility, and emotional instability. Every word was false, but it was written convincingly. My hands started shaking. "Who wrote this?" Samuel looked at me. "We're still finding out." I swallowed. Then I noticed something at the bottom. A doctor's name. I recognized it. Dr. Martin Hale. He had been Ethan's family physician for years. Suddenly, everything made sense. The questions, the concern, the rehearsed conversations. They weren't collecting evidence. They were manufacturing it. I closed my eyes. For the first time, tears came. Not because I was scared. Because I remembered teaching Ethan to ride a bicycle. I remembered holding the back of his seat while he screamed that he was going to fall. I remembered letting go. He rode down the street without me. And now, decades later, I was watching my own son push me toward a life where I wouldn't be allowed to make decisions for myself. I wiped my eyes. Samuel didn't say anything. He simply waited. Finally, I looked up. "Thanksgiving is still happening." Samuel nodded. "That may be the best place to expose them. But I need one more thing." "What?" "Proof they can't explain away." Samuel understood immediately. So we made a plan. For the next 4 days, I continued acting confused. I repeated harmless questions. I occasionally pretended to forget where I had left my glasses. I even asked Ethan the same story twice. Every time, he looked at Vanessa. Every time, she gave him a tiny nod. They were becoming confident. Exactly as I wanted. Then 2 days before Thanksgiving, I heard something on the camera that changed the entire plan. Vanessa was speaking to Ethan in the office. Her voice was excited. The doctor agreed. Ethan exhaled. "Good. When should we do it?" "Thanksgiving morning." I froze. Thanksgiving morning? Not after dinner. Not later. before the guests even arrived. Then Vanessa asked, "And the family?" Ethan answered with a sentence that made my blood run cold. "They'll see him confused at breakfast. After that, nobody will question what happens." I slowly lowered the phone. They weren't waiting for Thanksgiving dinner. They were planning to begin the final stage that morning. And they had no idea that I had already prepared something that would turn their carefully rehearsed performance into the biggest mistake they had ever made. Thanksgiving morning arrived before I was ready for it. At 6:12 a.m., I was already awake. The house was silent. For a few minutes, I sat on the edge of my bed and listened to the furnace humming beneath the floor. Then I looked at Evelyn's photograph. "Today," I whispered, "I need you with me." I wasn't asking for revenge. Not anymore. I was asking for the strength to accept what my son had become. At 7:30, Ethan came downstairs. He smiled. "Morning, Dad." I smiled back. "Morning, son." He studied my face. "Did you sleep well?" "Like a baby." His expression tightened for half a second. Then Vanessa appeared behind him. She was dressed beautifully. Too beautifully for someone preparing breakfast. She carried a small folder. I noticed it immediately. "What's that?" I asked. She quickly pulled it against her chest. "Nothing important." I nodded. Of course. They thought I was confused. They had no idea I had memorized every detail. At 8:05, the doorbell rang. Dr. Martin Hale walked inside. My son's doctor. The man who had apparently agreed to help create a medical story about me. He shook my hand. "Arthur, how are you feeling today?" "Wonderful." He smiled. "Any trouble remembering things?" There it was. The question they had rehearsed. I pretended to think. "Sometimes." Ethan immediately looked at him. Dr. Hale gave the smallest nod. I almost felt sorry for them. They were so confident. So convinced they had already won. Then Dr. Hale asked me what day it was. "Thursday." "And what holiday is today?" "Thanksgiving." "And where are you?" I looked around. "My home." He smiled. But I saw the disappointment in his eyes. I hadn't failed the test. I had passed it. Vanessa stepped forward. "Maybe Dad should rest." Ethan nodded. "That might be best." Then he quietly picked up his phone. I knew what he was doing. He was documenting the scene. Creating a record. An elderly father appearing confused while his concerned son tried to help him. Exactly the story they needed. So I gave them one more gift. I deliberately picked up the wrong coat. I looked embarrassed. "Oh." Ethan rushed toward me. "Dad, that's mine." I stared at it, then laughed softly. "Sorry." Vanessa exchanged a glance with Ethan. They thought they had their evidence. But what they didn't know was that Samuel had arranged something of his own. At 9:15, another vehicle stopped outside. Not a medical transport. Not an ambulance. A county vehicle. I watched through the window as two investigators stepped out. Samuel had contacted the authorities before the morning began. They weren't there to arrest anyone. Not yet. They were there because the bank's fraud investigation had uncovered another transaction. Someone had attempted to transfer ownership of part of my property. That attempt had been made less than an hour earlier, and it carried a digital authorization linked to the same forged documents. I stared at the screen Samuel had sent me. My son had tried to move my property while I was standing downstairs. He hadn't even waited until I was out of the house. I felt something inside me go completely still. At 11:40, guests began arriving. Neighbors, friends, business associates, family members who had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. Ethan greeted every one of them with a smile. Vanessa hugged people. Food filled the kitchen. Music played softly. The house looked like a perfect Thanksgiving celebration. But beneath that beautiful surface, something ugly was waiting. I walked into the dining room and saw the head chair. Evelyn's chair. The chair where I had sat for nearly 30 years. I touched its wooden back. Then I heard Vanessa behind me. "Arthur?" I turned. She smiled. "There's something we need to discuss before everyone sits down." Her voice was gentle, almost loving, and that frightened me more than if she had screamed. Because I knew what was coming. She wasn't asking me to move. She was about to tell me that, in my own house, I no longer had the right to choose where I sat. And this time, I wasn't going to pretend I didn't understand. Vanessa stood beside the dining table with that same polite smile. "Arthur, before everyone sits down, Ethan and I think it would be better if you joined the children in the family room." I looked at her. "Why?" She glanced at Ethan. He stepped forward. "Dad, you know you've been struggling lately." There it was. The story they had been rehearsing. I looked around the room. My sister-in-law's family was arriving. Old neighbors were taking off their coats. Ethan's business associates were laughing near the kitchen. Nobody understood what was really happening. Then Vanessa lowered her voice. "We just don't want you overwhelmed." I smiled. "Overwhelmed?" Ethan nodded. "You've been forgetting things." I looked directly at him. "Such as?" He hesitated. That tiny hesitation told me everything. He had prepared accusations, but he hadn't prepared answers. "I don't think we should do this here," he muttered. "No," I said calmly. "I think this is exactly where you should do it." His face changed. For the first time all morning, Ethan looked nervous. Vanessa quickly stepped in. "Arthur, please don't make this difficult." I looked at her. "You've already made it difficult." The room became quiet. A few people turned toward us. Ethan whispered, "Dad." I raised my hand. "Let me ask one question." Nobody moved. "Why did a doctor come to my house this morning asking me questions about my memory?" Vanessa froze. Ethan stared at me. I continued. "And why did someone attempt to transfer part of my property less than an hour ago?" A glass slipped from someone's hand. It struck the floor and shattered. Ethan's face went completely pale. "You don't understand what you're talking about." I smiled sadly. "That is exactly what you wanted everyone to believe." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Ethan changed tactics. His voice became soft. "Dad, you're confused." I nodded slowly. "That word again." Vanessa looked at the guests. "Everyone, please understand. He's been under a lot of stress." I watched her. She was performing now. Not for me. For the room. She wanted witnesses. Exactly as Samuel had predicted. So I gave her what she wanted. Witnesses. But not the kind she expected. I reached into my jacket and removed a small envelope. I placed it on the table. Inside this are copies of the documents used to take out a loan against my house. Ethan stepped forward. "Dad, stop. There's also a copy of the power of attorney you supposedly received from me." His jaw tightened. "I never said I received anything." "No," I said. "You said you didn't need me to sign anymore." Silence. Ethan's face changed. Vanessa looked at him. He looked at her. Neither spoke. Someone near the kitchen whispered, "What does that mean?" I didn't answer. Instead, I pulled out my phone. I also have recordings. Ethan took a step toward me. "You recorded us?" I protected myself. "You can't do this." I looked at him. "You were planning to put me in a facility." His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Then Vanessa suddenly shouted, "He doesn't know what he's saying." I looked at her. "I know exactly what I'm saying." And then I played the first recording. Ethan's own voice filled the room. "We don't need him to sign anymore." Nobody moved. The recording continued. "Once he's declared incapable, everything becomes easier." A woman near the table covered her mouth. Ethan lunged toward the phone. I stepped backward, and then the front door opened. Samuel walked inside. Behind him were 2 county investigators. And suddenly Ethan understood. This wasn't a family argument anymore. It was an investigation. Samuel placed a thick folder on the table. "Ethan Bennett," he said calmly, "you need to listen very carefully." Ethan stared at him. "What is this?" Samuel opened the folder. "Your bank records. The fraudulent loan application. The forged authorization. The property transfer attempt." He placed each document on the table. Then he added one final page. "This one is particularly interesting." Ethan looked down. His expression collapsed. It was a copy of the medical report they had prepared about me. But there was something on the bottom that neither Ethan nor Vanessa had noticed. A signature. Not mine. Not Dr. Hale's. It belonged to someone else. Samuel looked at Vanessa. "Would you like to explain why your handwriting appears on the supporting statement?" Vanessa stepped backward, and for the first time, the woman who had spent weeks making me feel powerless looked genuinely terrified. But Samuel wasn't finished. He turned toward the dining room. "Ladies and gentlemen, there's something else you should know." Then he looked at me. I gave him a small nod. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a second folder. "This one explains exactly where the missing jewelry went." My heart stopped, because I had spent weeks believing Evelyn's jewelry had simply been stolen. But Samuel knew where it was, and the person who had sold it had left behind a record that could destroy everything Ethan and Vanessa had built. Samuel opened the folder. Inside was a photograph. A small velvet box sat on a wooden counter. I recognized it immediately. Evelyn's box. My throat tightened. For a moment, the room disappeared. I was no longer standing in front of 32 people. I was back in our bedroom years earlier, watching Evelyn place her wedding ring into that same box before going to sleep. Samuel placed another document beside the photograph. A pawn transaction, he said. 2 pieces of jewelry. Sold 12 days ago. I looked at the name on the receipt. Vanessa Bennett. My daughter-in-law. Someone gasped. Vanessa shook her head violently. No, that's impossible. Samuel turned the receipt around. You used your driver's license. Her face lost all color. Ethan stared at her. You sold them? She looked at him. You told me we needed the money. The room became completely silent. Ethan's expression changed. For the first time, I saw something I hadn't expected. He wasn't defending her. He was afraid of her. Vanessa realized what she had just admitted. She covered her mouth. I closed my eyes. The pain wasn't about the jewelry anymore. It was about Evelyn. Those rings had survived 40 years of marriage. They had survived hospital rooms, business failures, mortgage payments, and every difficult year we had faced together. And my family had turned them into cash. I opened my eyes. Where are they now? Samuel answered. The pawn shop still has them. The police have secured them as evidence. I nodded. At least one part of Evelyn was coming home. Then Ethan suddenly stepped toward me. Dad, please. I looked at him. His voice was different now. No confidence. No arrogance. Just fear. I made mistakes. I waited. I can fix this. You had months to fix it. He swallowed. I was desperate. So you chose me? His eyes filled with tears. I didn't want to hurt you. I stared at my son. Then why did you plan to have me declared incompetent? He couldn't answer. That silence was the answer. Samuel opened another document. There's more. Ethan looked at him. Samuel continued. The loan wasn't intended to save your business. Ethan's eyes widened. You owe several creditors. He said nothing. Samuel placed another page on the table. Nearly $400,000. A murmur spread through the room. Ethan looked toward his business associates. They suddenly seemed very interested in leaving. Samuel continued. And according to the records we've obtained, you plan to use the equity from Arthur's house to pay those debts. Ethan whispered, I didn't have a choice. I looked at him. You always had a choice. He stared at me. I continued quietly. You could have asked me for help. His eyes dropped. I would have helped you. That was the moment his face broke. Not when the investigators arrived. Not when the recordings played. Not when his debts were exposed. When he realized the man he had tried to destroy would still have helped him. Ethan began crying. I was ashamed. I felt tears burning behind my eyes. So you decided to make me ashamed instead? He couldn't look at me. Vanessa suddenly spoke. This was Ethan's idea. He turned toward her. Don't. You told me to sell the jewelry. You signed the documents. You said your father would never know. The room erupted. Their marriage collapsed in front of everyone. The same people they had invited to witness my humiliation were now watching them accuse each other. Samuel quietly stepped between them. That's enough. 2 investigators moved closer. Ethan looked at me one last time. Dad. I looked at him. Can you forgive me? That question hurt more than anything else. Because part of me still wanted to say yes. He was still my son. But forgiveness didn't mean pretending nothing happened. I took a slow breath. I hope someday I can. His eyes filled again. But forgiveness doesn't mean I let you keep hurting me. The investigators placed him under arrest. Vanessa was taken separately for questioning. As Ethan walked toward the door, he turned around. For 1 second, I saw the little boy who used to ride his bicycle down our driveway. Then the door closed. The house became silent. The Thanksgiving table was still covered with food. The turkey was getting cold. And 32 people stood around it without knowing where to look. I walked to the head chair. The chair Vanessa had tried to take away from me. I pulled it back. Then I sat down. Not because I needed to prove anything. Because I finally understood something. They had spent weeks trying to convince me that I was becoming powerless. But they had made one terrible mistake. They confused my silence with surrender. And as I looked at Evelyn's empty place across the table, Samuel quietly placed one final envelope beside my plate. Arthur, he said, there's one more thing. I looked at him. What? He lowered his voice. This investigation didn't begin with your son. My heart stopped. Then who started it? Samuel looked toward the closed front door, and his answer made me realize that the betrayal inside my house might be much bigger than I ever imagined. This investigation didn't begin with your son. Samuel's words stayed in my head long after Ethan, and Vanessa were gone. I looked at him. Then who started it? Samuel opened the final envelope. Inside was a report from a private investigator. There was a name on the first page. A former business associate of Ethan's. A man named Victor Langley. Victor had discovered that Ethan's consulting company was drowning in debt months before I knew anything was wrong. Instead of reporting him immediately, Victor had offered Ethan money. Then Ethan borrowed more. And more. Eventually, the debt became impossible to hide. Samuel explained that Victor had been pressuring Ethan for months. The house had become Ethan's only realistic way out. That's when my son started looking at me differently. Not as his father, as an asset. That realization hurt in a way no courtroom could measure. I had spent my life believing family was the one place where a person could put down his guard. I was wrong. Sometimes the people closest to you know exactly where your heart is weakest. And sometimes they use that knowledge against you. But there was one thing Ethan and Vanessa had failed to understand. They had not destroyed me. They had exposed themselves. The bank permanently canceled the fraudulent loan. The property transfer was stopped. The forged documents were turned over to investigators. And several weeks later, Evelyn's jewelry came home. I drove nearly 2 hours to retrieve it myself. When the pawnshop owner placed the velvet box in my hands, I couldn't open it. I just held it. My fingers trembled. For years, I had imagined the day I would hold those rings again. I had imagined feeling relief. Instead, I felt grief. Because Evelyn wasn't there to see them come home. I finally opened the box. Her wedding ring was inside. I touched it with my thumb. Then I whispered, I brought them back. That night, I placed the ring beside her photograph. The house was quiet. For the first time in months, the silence didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like peace. I walked through the dining room. The Thanksgiving decorations were still hanging. The chairs were pushed back. The table had been cleared. But I stopped at the head chair. The same chair Vanessa had told me I wasn't welcome to sit in. I ran my hand across its wooden arm. Then I sat down. I thought about everything that had happened. The forged loan. The missing jewelry. The fake medical report. The recordings. The humiliation. My son's tears. And the terrible question he had asked me. Can you forgive me? I still didn't know the answer. Maybe forgiveness takes longer than anger. Maybe some wounds don't disappear. Maybe they simply become part of the person you are. But I had learned something important. Being a father doesn't mean allowing your children to destroy you. Being generous doesn't mean surrendering your boundaries. And loving someone doesn't mean giving them unlimited permission to hurt you. For 40 years, I protected my business from bad deals. I protected my employees from dishonest partners. I protected my family from financial hardship. But I had never considered that one day, I might have to protect myself from my own family. That was the hardest lesson of my life. Not because I lost my son. Because I realized I had to stop chasing the version of him that existed in my memories. The little boy was still alive in my heart. But the man standing in front of me had made his own choices. And I had to respect those choices enough to let him face their consequences. Months later, I changed the locks. Not out of hatred. Out of wisdom. I moved my office back upstairs. I restored Evelyn's garden. I started eating dinner at the dining table again. Sometimes I even caught myself smiling. Life didn't become perfect. It became honest. And there is a difference. One Sunday afternoon, I sat on the porch with Evelyn's photograph beside me. The sun was setting over the trees. I raised my coffee cup toward her picture. I think we're going to be okay, I said. Then I looked at the empty chair beside me. For years, I thought protecting my family meant holding everyone close. Now I understood something different. Sometimes protecting your family means protecting yourself first. Because if you allow someone to destroy your dignity in the name of love, eventually there will be nothing left of the person they claim to love. I didn't win because Ethan was arrested. I didn't win because Vanessa was exposed. I won because they didn't get to rewrite my story. They wanted everyone to see an old, confused father who had become a burden. Instead, everyone saw the truth. A man who had spent his entire life building something. A husband who never forgot the woman he loved. A father who had given more than he should have. And finally, a man who understood that patience is not permission. That night, I returned to the dining room one last time. I pulled out Evelyn's chair. I placed her photograph across from mine. Then I sat at the head of the table. The chair was still mine. The house was still mine. My memories were still mine. And most importantly, my life was still mine. I had spent 40 years building it. I wasn't going to spend the rest of it apologizing for protecting it. So if there's one thing I hope you remember from my story, let it be this. Never mistake someone's kindness for weakness. And never let the word family become an excuse for someone to take away your dignity. Sometimes the strongest thing an older person can do isn't shouting. It isn't revenge. It is simply standing up, looking at the people who underestimated them, and saying, "You don't get to decide what I am worth." And that Thanksgiving, when they tried to take my seat from me, they unknowingly gave me something far more valuable: the courage to finally take my life back. Sometimes the deepest betrayal comes from the people we trusted enough to let into our homes and our hearts. But kindness should never be mistaken for weakness, and being a loving parent does not mean surrendering your dignity, your peace, or everything you worked your entire life to build. Arthur learned that protecting yourself isn't selfish, even when the people you're protecting yourself from share your blood. Sometimes the strongest form of revenge isn't anger or cruelty. It's staying calm, discovering the truth, standing your ground, and refusing to let anyone rewrite your worth. What would you do? If this story touched you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more emotional family stories about betrayal, justice, and the strength it takes to stand up for yourself. And I want to hear from you. What would you do if your own son or daughter tried to take advantage of you like Arthur's family did? Would you confront them immediately, stay quiet and gather evidence, or walk away and protect yourself? Tell me your answer in the comments, and let us know where you're watching from today. Your story might help someone else who is going through something similar.